Hey guys, welcome to week 22. This week we are studying the building of global empires. We'll be talking about imperialism and the need of industrialized countries to go in and take over non-industrialized countries, both for the natural resources and for the market potential. So, just to get started, this is the map we did. I know you remember it so fondly. So we're going to start talking about how all these countries started taking over all these other regions. So the ideas of imperialism started in the 19th centuries, and we're going to see that it's really going to begin and become very popular in the 1880s. It's going to start with military imperialism, and then it'll later turn into economic, then cultural. Then we'll discuss the U.S. imperialism. Now, the motives for imperialism are military, political, economic, religious, and demographic. We're going to see that there's going to be so many reasons why imperialism come, but I think we can all agree that economics is going to be the reason to start it, but military dominance is what's going to maintain it. Now, manifest destiny is a component of the U.S. imperialism that is a huge foundation for imperialism for the United States, and it's kind of unique because other countries don't really use manifest destiny as their resource or their justification, but the U.S. is a huge reason. Now, what in manifest destiny is the discovery of natural resource, is going to justify their need for labor and their need for the expansion of markets. The idea or the belief that America is entitled to the rest of the continent, entitled to the land, and entitled to whatever people they find there because we are American, is the belief behind manifest destiny, that we control our own destiny, we control our own future. Now, when we talk about geopolitical foundations, they are probably the most important component of imperialism because the geopolitical situations that we're going to see arising are going to eventually lead to what will be two massive world wars and plenty of other conflicts. Now, the most important thing a country can do for imperialism during this time period is looking for strategic footholds. Waterways, supply stations, imperial rivalries are going to be important because they're going to be trying to compete with one another. So trying to find areas that gives them the most advantage, both economically and military, is going to be a key. So those territories where these are going to be found are going to be the most desired. Now, one of the big motivations behind the imperialism is going to be the white man's burden. It was written by Kipling, and he believes it is the duty of all white men to go out and educate the world about the ways in which the white men have come about, have become powerful, successful militarily, economically, politically, socially, all those different components. So it's essentially their responsibility to educate. This will eventually become the foundation of the moral guidepost of imperialism, that it's our moral duty to spread our technology and force these native people into these imperialistic colonies because we're helping them in the long term. So very interesting. Now, when we start talking about domestic political considerations, the reason why people are going out and starting imperialist colonies is because of industrialism. There's so many needs that have to be satisfied, specifically natural resources, specifically lots of people are trying to find an easier way to sell their products. We're going to see a lot of pressure from socialism that they have to find a solution or they are afraid the system might collapse into it. We're also going to see that we are going to try to fix the middle class and try to make their lives better. Now, the easiest way you can fix the middle class is by having more money. Having more money means more markets. More markets mean we're trying to improve the wealth. Now, if everyone is wealthier, less problems. The more wealth a country has, the less social, political, economic, and cultural problems a country has. The less wealth it has, the more problems it's going to have on those fronts. So, essentially, the more money you have, the better your country is going to be. So, another reason why imperialism is going to kick off. Now, technology is also going to play a major role. Steamships, railroads are going to allow these European, essentially dominant countries to go into these new native territories and take over in massive ways. The steamships are going to allow them to get deeper into Africa, which has never really happened to the depth in which infrastructure, the technology to build the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal are going to allow European countries to dominate the world in a way that they've never done before, because they're going to increase travel. And their ability to travel fast will therefore change the way they govern the people. Now, weaponry is also a huge thing. Remember, a lot of the imperialism is based not only on economic profit, but military success. And one of the largest military successes about this time is the fact that they can kill so much faster, just because of the technology of weapons. Beforehand, you had only one bullet. You had to pump and pack and gunpowder and shoot, and then it took about 45 seconds to recharge. Now they can do it in split seconds, which is pretty impressive. We're going to see this military advantage be encapsulated near the Battle of Ordurum. Well, the British are only going to lose a few hundred, but the Sudanese are going to lose thousands of people, which is a pretty crazy, significant loss, obviously. It's going to show how advanced they are, and this will be the warning to all other native cultures that you can only oppose these European outsiders for so long, because eventually if they use their weapons, it's going to be much more successful than you will be. Now, communication is also going to be a huge thing. Now, the reason why communication is so important is because now governments are able to directly control and directly manipulate their colonies. With that being said, colonies are no longer going to be off in the distance and kind of thought of second. Now they're going to be able to be controlled immediately, which is going to be better for the home country, worse off for the colonies. Correspondence and telegraph are going to increase this technology. Before, it took 2 years. After the Suez Canal to get to India, it took 2 weeks. The telegraph, it only takes 5 hours to send a message. I mean, these types of things are going to change the way, specifically the British are going to interact with their colonies and how much influence they're going to have, which will be significant. Now, India is probably the most famous of the imperialistic colonies. It's going to be held by Britain. Now, Britain refers to India as the crown the jewel in the crown it is the jewel in the British crown, because of the amount of natural resources and the large markets or places where they can sell their goods. Now, India and Britain have had a long relationship. The British East India Trade Company has been trading with India for centuries at this point, since period 3. They are going to eventually become dominant in Indian trade. And because of this, because they have such a long-lasting relationship, they allow the Mughal emperors to continue to rule. And these are from period 4. They're going to allow them to rule. However, we're going to see that their power is going to eventually lose out. Now, the British conquest is going to start occurring. Now, the British are going to try to ensure that their crown jewel, India, is going to be well protected. So they start conquering other territories around India, just to ensure that their prized possession is well protected. And they're going to start doing this by political conquest, the doctrine of lapse. And they're going to start hiring Indian troops to wear the British uniform and support British law. This was done in order for the Indians to see that they are a part of the government. They are a part of their own laws, even though it was a complete facade. Just so they are not just completely pushing down and forcing the Indians to submit. Now, this is all going to change with the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. There's a rumor started probably by the Dutch East India Trade Company, who tell all of these Indian soldiers that, psst, the guns are greased with beef, or psst, the guns are greased with pork, depending on what religion they were, in order to get them to revolt. Well, they do revolt because obviously it goes against their religion, either Hindu or Muslim, which is the majority of Indian population, and they're going to revolt. Now, it's going to be a very small-scale revolt compared to most of the other ones we've seen. However, it is going to ignite anti-British revolution that later on will eventually end the British rule. However, it's going to be very significant because the British are going to kind of overreact and it's going to have very harsh consequences for the British, which is only going to make their anti-British movement stronger, but it's going to take a while to get going. One of the first things that the British Empire does after the Sepoy Rebellion is to abolish the Mughal Empire. So no longer is there any Indian ruler allowed to be in place in India. They're going to abolish the East India Trade Company. Like I said, the rumors stated that they were a part of starting the rebellion, as well as they're going to have a much firmer, stronger control over what is going on in India because they would hate to lose their best possession. Now, the British rule in India, the reason why they're there is for the natural resources, specifically tea, coffee, and opium. All of these are going to be exported directly out of India, and they're going to try to manipulate the Indian culture. Now, using India as a base, the British specifically, as well as the French and the Russians, are going to compete for Asia. Now, the French are going to drop out of imperialism after the Napoleonic Wars just because they've got a lot going on. Russia is going to stay pretty active, and eventually Russia and Britain are going to go head-to-head in what we call the Great Game. Now, Russia and Britain are essentially in a little Cold War with one another. They're both waiting for each other to cross the line, and the world's essentially waiting for them to explode and start fighting and attacking each other and doing all these terrible things. The good thing is for the world that it never happens. The bad thing is the Russians fall into the Russian Revolution. The Russians and the British never really go at it, even though they have seriously big trust issues. The reason why is because the 1917 Russian Revolution is going to occur, and we're also going to see World War I is going to break out, lots of other things going on. Now, in Southeast Asia, we're going to see the Spanish are going to conquer the Philippines, which will later be taken over by the U.S. The British established a presence from 1820s in Burma. They're going to use take over Singapore. They're going to try to find as much territory over in Asia as possible in order to support India and ensure that their crown jewel of India is going to be well protected. Now, the French are really the only country that are going around trying to force religion upon their colonies. All the other ones are pretty secular about their beliefs, but the Frenchies are the only ones going around and preaching religion. So now that we talked about Asia, we're going to get started in Africa. Now, the scramble for Africa is going to occur from 1875 to 1900. This is when specifically the French, the Portuguese, the Belgians, and the English are competing for Africa. Now, they're competing for the natural resources as well as a market to sell their goods, kind of like Asia, but we're going to see that Africa is essentially just going to be used for its natural resources. Now, Britain is going to establish a very strong presence in Egypt because of the Suez Canal, which is the reason why they built it there. I mean, it's obviously the best place to build a canal, but because of the Suez Canal, they make sure that they are controlling the area, which would be controlling Egypt. We're going to see that the gold and diamonds are going to be one of the largest exports of Africa. Now, what we're going to see, each in Africa, as we know, we've discovered, is going to be used to justify imperialist rule because clearly the Africans are not industrializing because the Africans have not evolved as far as the Europeans. The Europeans are saying, well, they haven't done it on their own. They need us. And we're kind of harping back to that white man burden. So the Europeans are going to take this advantage of having both the technological advantage as well as the economic advantage, and they're going to start exploring Africa, going through the rivers mostly and looking at the inner makings of Africa. This is really the first time we're going to be able to do that, A, because we have the technology, and B, they have the desire to see what's there because they need the natural resources. Now, they're starting to collect information from the interior of Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium starts the Congo, which is a free state for commercial ventures, which means they're making direct profit off of the natural resources that the other Europeans are taking. We're also going to see that European countries are no longer just staying on the outskirts of Africa along the coastline, but they're also going into the heart of Africa and conquering and trying to take over territory. Now, one of the largest and probably the most important conflicts in Africa is going to be the South African Boer War, which is from 1899 to 1902. The Dutch East India Trade Company is going to establish Cape Town back in 1652. Now, the Dutch are going to have a presence there for a very long time. Now, the farmers, who are known as the Boers, follow to settle a territory. So these are Dutch citizens who are moving to South Africa in order to set up a territory, and they will eventually be recalled Afrikaners. Now, the competition between these local Africans and these transplanted Dutch is going to cause a lot of problem. And it's going to have a huge conflict. Now, the British are going to eventually come in and take over Cape Town in 1806, and they're going to come in and try to take as many slaves as possible, and for their own use as well as exporting for profit. Now, the Afrikaners are migrating eastwards towards they're migrating eastward, and they're going to see that because the British have superior weapons, they really are no match. They are going to settle and create independent republics, but they're not going to be as unified as they previously were. Now, the British are going to accept these terms, that they get out of their way, they go up north, they stay out of the British way until the British figure out they have gold. The moment the British figure out that they have gold where these new civilizations are popping up, they're back interested in taking over this. So there's going to be a white-on-white conflict. It's now the Dutch Afrikaners versus the British. They are fighting with black soldiers and laborers, and it's a huge, big mess. Eventually, the Dutch are going to concede in 1902. And then in 1910, they're going to be integrated into the Union of South Africa. So eventually they'll be blended in. Now, the Berlin West African Conference is when 14 European states, including the United States, are going to come together to discuss the rules of Africa. Now, the Berlin Conference is one of the most politically damning thing the Europeans do against the continent of Africa, because in this conference they essentially sit around at a table, cut up Africa, fight amongst themselves, while there is zero representatives who have actually come from Africa. Europe is dividing a continent in which there's no person from Africa at the table, which is pretty horrifying, and this explains how Europeans thought about Africa. They thought it was their own territory, and it didn't matter if people were living there, and civilizations have come and gone. They didn't care. The rules of colonization was the foundation of the conference. Any European state could take over unoccupied territory once they told the other European nations. So it's all about open communication, because they didn't want European people killing other European people. They felt that European blood was too important to be shed over Africa, so why don't we talk it out, have a plan, and go forward. But keep in mind, they're going to be killing as many Africans as they choose without any consequences or negative ill will. Now, European firepower dominates Europe, so the only countries that aren't going to be taken are essentially Ethiopia, who are going to fight off Italy, and Liberia, who is a dependency of the United States. So these two countries, Ethiopia and Liberia, are the only ones who are going to stay independent during the imperialistic period, because they're fighting off all these European powers, which is very impressive. Now, when we talk about colonial rule, we're talking about there's two different ways. There's concessionary companies, which are private companies get large tracts of lands to exploit the natural resources. So essentially, private companies come in and they just do whatever they need to get the natural resources necessary for profit, and then they bring them back. Now, these companies get freedom to tax, recruit labor, and have horrible abuses. This is where things get really, really bad, and this is where imperialism really gets a terrible name. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do, don't get me wrong, but it's really a terrible thing. So when we have private companies come in, they're essentially go unchecked, and they're making good money, but they're not making crazy good money. Now, direct rule is also going to be a very popular way. Specifically, the French are the biggest fan of this. The French believe that they're civilizing the world. They are trying to force all the people in these territories to be French. Direct rule means they are changing the culture, the politics, the economy, the social components. They're changing everything about it in order to make these natives more French. French West Africa is going to have about 3,600 Europeans controlling and dominating over 9 million Africans. This is how powerful they are in regards to everyone else. Now, indirect rule, which is a little bit friendlier than direct rule, is going to be used by the British. However, the British, in the case of India, are going to be a lot more severe because of the Sepoy Rebellion and the consequences of that. We're going to see that in direct rule, we're going to use the indigenous population to help our needs. An example of this for the British would be the Sepoy soldiers. So hiring Indians to work for the British is a perfect example. Now, the problem with indirect rule is that it has a very challenging problem of trying to integrate traditional and British ideas in order to make it work. And they're also going to start imposing arbitrary boundaries that never existed before because of tribal differences. So we're going to see this is going to destroy a lot of culture as well. Not as much as direct rule, because direct rule is going to change it in the most aggressive way possible. Indirect rule is theoretically kinder, but it's still going to destroy a lot of culture and ruin a lot of lives. So when we start talking about imperialism, we have to talk about Oceania. Now, this is really when Oceania is starting to really get going here. We have pretty much ignored Oceania through most of the year, but this is when Oceania is starting to really come on the map because all these European countries are trying to take over it. Now, European imperialism is going to really start around Australia and New Zealand. Now, Australia and New Zealand are going to be settled by the British, which is why they speak English here today. For the beginning, the English are going to use Australia as a penal colony. So anyone who did anything wrong, for instance, stealing, embezzling money, white-collar crimes, all those types of things, even violent crimes, they're going to be sent there starting from 1788. So they essentially drop you off on a boat and say, good luck, and if you survive, then you're good. If you die, then you die. So it's kind of sink or swim. I guess it's better than sitting in a jail prison for your whole life. We're also going to see voluntary migration. Some people are just going to up and leave England. Keep in mind that England is a very rigored social structure, so it's very hard to move up in social structure. So essentially leaving England is going to be easier, A, to make money, and to improve your station in life. People are also going to leave to chase after the gold dream and go hunt gold both in the Americas and in Australia. We're going to see smallpox and measles are going to devastate the natives both in Australia and New Zealand, quite like they did in the Americas in period 3. We're going to see that New Zealand is going to be forced to sign a treaty, which means that New Zealand is going to be under British protection. They're going to be forced to do so, not obviously by choice, but it's going to be very beneficial, of course, for the British, not so much for the New Zealanders, I guess. Now, when the Europeans start showing up in these Oceania, specifically Australia and New Zealand, we're going to see that the significant movement of Europeans into this territory is overwhelming, just night and day. So we're going to see a lot more European cultures, belief systems, and all that, not only being forced on the people, but being supported by the European people who have now come and moved in. Now, European imperialism is going to also affect the Pacific Islands. They're looking for outposts in order to connect Asia to the Americas, specifically the West Coast. At this point, San Francisco is growing into one of the largest cities in the world because of its trade power and its ability to connect because of the transcontinental railroad here in the United States. It's going to be able to connect what is the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States and allow profits to go. Merchants are seeking sandalwood and sea slugs for sale in China. They're now incredibly profitable, as well as missionaries are trying to save souls. Mostly this is going to be the French. Now the British, the French, the German, and the Americans are going to carve up the Pacific Islands because they want to collect them for goods. Now we're going to see that only a few are going to remain independent, but most of them are going to fall to England, France, and the United States. Now, the belief that the United States has clean hands in regards to imperialism because we're a nation born of revolution is completely delusional. James Monroe warns Europeans not to engage in imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, not because the United States opposes imperialism, but because they did not want European powers to be too close to the American shores to stage an attack on the United States. So James Monroe writes the Monroe Doctrine, which says that any American, whether South America, North American country, is under American protection. It's an American protectorate. So if you attack any or try to imperialize any American, whether South or North, you are essentially attacking American territory. So this is the first foundation of American imperialism. So technically they just declare the whole hemisphere. In 1867, we're going to purchase Alaska from Russia, and this is going to add significant vast wealth of land as well as resources. In 1875, we are going to establish a protectorate over Hawaii. The Hawaiian one is pretty interesting because we're going to stage a coup, and it is all based on profits of sugar, and we lied, cheated, and stole Hawaii from these people, and we did terrible things to get it, but we got it, and it still has a lot of negative tension in Hawaii still today about it, and because of the eradication of culture as well. Now, the Spanish-Cuban-American War, the U.S. is going to declare war on Spain after the battleship Maine is sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898. Now, because of the Monroe Doctrine, the Spanish were warned that if you come in and attack anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, North America or South America, that you are essentially attacking the United States. So because of that, the United States waged a war. Eventually, the United States is going to intervene in other Caribbean, Central American conflicts, specifically the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Honduras and Haiti. So this is the first step of America getting involved in a lot of regional politics because they want to keep the Europeans out. They want to keep the Europeans out, so the United States can maintain economic control as well as political control. Now, the Filipinos are going to revolt against Spanish rule and later fight back against the United States' rule. Keep in mind, United States is coming in and we're doing the same exact thing that the Europeans are doing. We're not coming in saying, oh, we're trying to protect your rights. Yay. They're coming in to sell goods and export the natural resources, which is exactly what Britain is doing. They just kind of try to hide it a little bit better. Now, one of the big things that the United States is going to do in South America is going to build the Panama Canal. Now, President Theodore Roosevelt, who is going to be involved in the Spanish-Cuban conflict, is going to support the idea of building the Panama Canal, which will cut travel time around the world significantly, almost in half, because no longer after it's built will you have to go all the way around the tip of South America, but in fact you can just cut right through. Now, in Panama, we're going to see that they have just won their own civil war and have created their own state of Panama. Well, Teddy Roosevelt is going to say, hey, since you just won, how about we become friends and we'll protect you and make sure that, your rights of your newly established country are going to maintain if you let us build this canal right through the middle of your territory. And because the newly established government was so shaky and nervous about it being successful, they said yes. And the United States built the Panama Canal in Panama, which was, quite the accomplishment of science and math. We're going to see that the United States is going to hold it up until about 10 years ago. We gave it back to Panama for the first time. Actually, I think it's even more recent than that. Anyway, we give it back to Panama after about 150 years of us holding, about 120 or 130 years of us holding control over it. Now, the U.S., Roosevelt is going to continue to use the Monroe Document. He believes that the Monroe Document states that the U.S. has the right to intervene in domestic affairs in other countries. So, we as the United States can get involved in other countries' problems if we feel like U.S. investments are being threatened. So we're seeing this Monroe Document that's saying imperialist countries don't come over here. We're protecting all these, now being used to interfere politically into other countries. So imperialism, not just economically, militarily, but now the United States is using it also politically. Now, the Japanese are also going to get into this imperialism wave. They are going to have resentment over unequal treaties starting from the 1860s with the dawn of the industrial era. Now, in the 1870s, they're going to start colonizing the northern region of Korea. They're going to start spreading up northwards, and they're going to start having conflict with the Russians, of course. Now, in 1876, the Japanese purchased warships from Britain, and they're going to use these to completely dominate Korea. We're going to have the Sino-Japanese War, which Japan is going to steal the victory over Korea. The Russo-Japanese War, which is going to make Japan a world power, and it is going to embarrass the Russians once again. Now, the legacies of imperialism around the world are, we're going to see that European powers are going to be consistently abusing their power and exploiting natural resources, and they're going to just be taking the natural resources and bringing it back to the home country instead of building manufacturing centers in these new colonies. So these territories in the Caribbean, all in India, they have the natural resources, but they're not getting the manufacturing. So not only have they not industrialized on their own, but the British specifically are not teaching them how to be industrialized, so they can't compete. So the British are stealing all the natural resources, but not teaching them anything about industrialization, which keeps them further behind. They're also going to encourage dependency on imperial powers for manufactured goods. When specifically England goes into India, they force the Indians to buy all of Britain's goods, but they're not making any of those goods there, nor are they teaching them how to make those goods there. So if India wants to continue buying these goods, they have to buy from England, which guarantees their market and solidifies their profits. We're also going to see that new crops are going to start popping up. Tea is going to start spreading out throughout the country. Throughout the world, I mean. We're also going to see the movement of people. People are going to be moving all over the world in order to find work. They're going to move to temperate lands. New Zealand, Australia are perfect examples. They're going to work as free cultivators or industrial laborers. About 32 million are going to move to the United States between 1800 and 1914. We're going to see that Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders are going to move to tropical and subtropical lands just to find jobs as indentured servants, laborers, and manual laborers. And we're going to see massive movements of people at this time trying to find a place to fit in. Now, there is going to be a lot of colonial conflict. Thousands of insurrections are going to occur. Please understand that the natives are not thrilled this is happening, but because of the technology, the military, the economics, the political, the social, and now the cultural manipulations that they're facing, it's very hard to overthrow these industrialized powers. We're going to see that the Germans are going to have a lot of pushback as well as the British, of course. Now, the scientific racism is going to start to develop. We're going to see social Darwinism, which is the belief that if the Africans were worthy of industrialization, they would have industrialized themselves. The belief that only the strongest will survive is going to start being used in a social context, and that social context is obviously going to be at a disadvantage for our colonial friends. Now, with all of this colonialism and imperialism going on, we're going to see that nationalism is growing even further. Now, nationalism is really going to start after the Napoleonic Wars. However, because of the sense of pride that England, France, Germany, United States have, and the success that they're having, because their economies are essentially exploding right now, we're going to see nationalism grow to a major high point, which is going to eventually cause World War I and lead into World War II. We're going to see that reformers are going to call for self-government, and they're going to try to have some selected practices from the British be adopted. We're going to see that even though a lot of imperialism is bad, especially for the native cultures, we're going to see that some of the positive things about Europe are going to be spread, specifically the ideas of the Enlightenment, self-control and self-government, and all these types of ideas are now going to be started in places of the world they didn't exist previously. Now, eventually, India is going to form the Indian National Congress in 1885, and it eventually will be turned into the All India Muslim League in 1816. So we start seeing some things that have never happened before. All right, guys, after this is the end of period 5, which means we just have one more period to go. So very exciting. It's definitely going fast. Now, next week, as you all know, it's writing week. We are doing DBQs. Anyway, hope you have a great week. See ya.